Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, step right up for a ride through my own backyard with a truly disturbing tale of a serial killer who once stalked the streets where I live, Humboldt County, California, abducting women and dumping their body parts in tributaries where they'd wash up on beaches and creeks, striking horror and terror in the community. But in the rarest of circumstances, he was a killer with a conscience and remorse, or so it seems. Ladies and gentlemen, we present to you the story of a killer in the Redwoods, Wayne Adam Ford.
Let's begin. Prologue. A Tale of Two Brothers. Monday, November 2nd, 1998. It was a long drive north for Rodney Ford, well over 5 hours. But he'd always been there for his little brother, and when Wayne called and said he needed help, Rodney immediately jumped in his car and headed up, out of the Bay Area, into Marin County and on to the 101, then up through the vineyards of Sonoma and into the redwoods of Mendocino and Humboldt County, through Eureka and Arcata, then skirting the coast, ever north.
It had been a long day for Rodney. He'd actually quit his job, and after the commute home from work in South San Francisco, he was looking forward to relaxing. But then the phone rang, and there was something alarming in the tone of his brother's voice, pleading for him to come north to Trinidad, that he was in trouble. His brother Wayne could be reckless, get in fights, act crazy. Whatever this trouble was, Rodney hoped it wasn't too serious.
Rodney didn't arrive in Trinidad until long after midnight. Trinidad is a serene little seaside town perched on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, 15 miles above the college town of Arcata, which then boasted Humboldt State, whose name has now been changed to Cal Poly Humboldt. Pulling off the 101 and onto the exit for Trinidad, Rodney then swung right up Patrick's Point Road. He motored into a strand of coastal redwoods, towering 300 feet up into the night sky. Then there was neon burning in the gloom, announcing cocktails, and Rodney was pulling into the smattering of cabins cramped between redwood trees that is the Ocean Grove Lodge.
By the office of the motel was the bar with the neon cocktails light eerily illuminating the ancient trees, where Rodney's brother Wayne spent most of his days. And to the left of the bar was a rustic cabin and a phone booth. And there was Wayne, standing in front of room 0 on the moldering and moss-covered tiny deck.
The cabin had once been a barber shop, long ago. When the barber moved on, the lodge owner scooped it up, called it Room 0.
I love that name, Room 0. Well, Room 0 was tiny, and the cheapest of all the rooms at $38.50 a night. And by the way, I love this town, Trinidad. I'd seriously like to retire there. Wonderful place. And the Coastal Grove Lodge is still there, Room 0, right out front. The place is a literal roadhouse, though it's looking more run down than ever now. The cocktail sign is long gone, and the restaurant and bar is only open a few days a week.
Rodney strode through night air fragrant with the ocean and the forest, the rowdy sound of the bar in the distance, and hugged his brother. Wayne looked terrible. His clothes were dirty and disheveled, his eyes swollen from crying, hair like a rat's nest. The two then went into the cabin, each sitting on a twin bed, and talked into the wee hours of the morning.
Wayne wasn't making any sense, and Rodney couldn't seem to get him to say what was bothering him so much. He kept breaking down into tears and rambled on about how their parents didn't love them, how cruel their mother had always been, how indifferent their father was. how traumatizing the divorce had been all those many years ago when they'd been children. Then he talked about his own ex-wife, saying he missed his son, who was still only a toddler. Finally, Rodney asked him bluntly,
Wayne, why am I here? What is going on?
"Oh, I hurt someone. I hurt someone bad."
Did you get into a bar fight? What'd you do? Break some guy's arm?
No, no, it's not like that. People. I I hurt some people. I want to go to the sheriff's office and turn myself in.
Wayne was often like this, doing something crazy and then filled with remorse for it. Even when they were little kids, like the time he'd broken into a sporting goods store or ran away from home and then been so filled with guilt that he'd actually turned himself into the police. But before Rodney could suss out what he'd actually done, who he'd hurt, Wayne was off on another tangent, talking about restoring muscle cars and wanting to know what kind of motor Rodney put into his Chevelle. He was just all over the place. Finally, the two brothers called it a night and went to sleep. Whatever it was that was bothering Wayne would have to wait until the morning.
They got up early and headed down the coast to the Denny's restaurant in Eureka for breakfast. Ugh, why? You know how many nice mom and pop diners you have to pass to get to that Denny's? Which, by the way, is now an international house of pancakes. What do you like better, International House of Pancakes or Denny's?
Oh man, I gotta say, long before I was in recovery for substance abuse, I had a huge soft spot in my heart for a good IHOP.
IHOP.
That's got to be my vote. How about
I'm a
you?
Denny's guy, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. We
I
used to
actually
hang
don't
out
know
at the
if there's.
Denny's all night, like, because they were open in the middle of the night. And I don't know.
I feel like the places that I've lived, there's been more IHOPs than Denny's. So, well, there you go. Anyway, the two brothers who'd grown up in the city of Eureka nostalgically drove about, visiting all their old haunts. The zoo with its lemurs and red panda, the houses where their uncles and grandmother had once lived, checking out the motorcycle shops. Then they hit the Bayshore Mall and went to Broadway Cinema to see John Carpenter's Vampires.
Cool movie. Gotta love John Carpenter flicks.
But they couldn't enjoy it because Wayne kept breaking down into tears, sobbing uncontrollably, saying he'd never see his son again. Rodney, growing frustrated, asked his brother, "What did you do, Wayne? Tell me."
I I can't tell you. You'll hate me forever. Everyone's gonna hate me. Just let's just go to the sheriff's station.
The two headed over to the Eureka Sheriff's Office, a large building that also hosts the county jail and the courthouse. But after parking and walking toward the entrance, Wayne started backing down, saying he no longer wanted to go there, that they'd never let him out again. Rodney, the older brother, was firm, telling him, "Come on, we're going in. I'll stay with you as long as I can."
Oh, okay, you're the big brother. Or so I imagine him saying. They went inside, talking to a receptionist over the phone through bulletproof glass. Rodney explaining his brother had hurt someone and wanted to turn himself in.
The receptionist ran his name. It was clean. Nothing came up. Eventually, a sheriff's deputy came out, asked them why they were there, with Wayne mumbling,
I don't want to hurt anyone. Once you see what I have in my pocket, you'll know. It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Rodney wondered what could be in his brother's pocket. Drugs? Is that what this was about? Or a weapon of some sort? A gun?
As Wayne slipped his fingers into his pocket to retrieve the mysterious item, the deputy told him to stop, to let him get it for safety reasons, asking if there was anything sharp that could hurt him in his pocket, like a knife or a syringe. Wayne saying, No, it's nothing like that.
The deputy slipped on a pair of rubber gloves and reached into Wayne's pocket, retrieving a Ziploc sandwich bag, leaking fluids over his hand. Puzzled, the deputy stared at it a moment. Gooey yellow lumps, a fleshy, rust-colored, nipple-like protrusion. But the seasoned deputy had seen human fat before. and it quickly became obvious what was in the bag: a woman's severed breast.
As the deputy froze for an instant in horror, the liquid running down his sleeve, Wayne meekly looked up at him and said, "Things are so screwed up in my head right now."
Wayne was quickly arrested for aggravated mayhem, the unlawful removal of a body part, and then confessed to a long string of rapes, murders, abductions, and tortures, picking some women up right off the streets of Eureka, and others in truck stops as he worked as a long-haul truck driver, dumping their bodies in waterways and drainage ditches throughout the state.
Wayne would take police back to the sleepy seaside town of Trinidad to show them where he'd buried other body parts in the Redwoods, beneath mammoth roots and rotten stumps, and tell them he'd baked human breasts in his oven and poured the melted fat into a coffee can, which he kept under his kitchen sink in a trailer in Arcata.
Despite cooking human flesh and saving the fat, as well as storing strips of thigh meat in his freezer for well over a year, Wayne would never admit to cannibalism.
Come on. Why are you cooking breasts and saving the fat? To make soap? Well, actually, we've seen that one before with our Spanish werewolf, among others. But Wayne was not making soap. And saving steaks of thighs, I don't know. It's very, very disturbing, and it's absolutely frightening, really scary, because no one ever suspected this guy of anything. He was a karaoke DJ, a pool shark at the local bar where he was beloved. Folks at the tight-knit trailer park where he lived all thought he was a stand-up guy and were horrified to realize he was in there quietly butchering and cooking a hitchhiker he'd picked up. And we're going to get into it later in the show. Even scarier, there was actually another serial killer in northern Humboldt at the same exact time.
The bizarre story of a man walking into a sheriff's station with a human breast in his pocket made world news, and everyone wanted to know, who was this remorseful serial killer? One of the very rare to turn themselves in and confess to their heinous crimes. How did this long-haul truck driver from the Redwoods named Wayne Adam Ford become this terrifying monster?
Ladies and gentlemen, Chapter 1, Petaluma.
Wayne Adam Ford was born on December 3rd, 1961, in Petaluma, California, 45 miles north of San Francisco in Sonoma County, to parents Jean and Karen, or Kitten, as she was sometimes known.
Wayne's mother, Kitten, was German, and his father, Jean, who was in the army, met her while stationed at a base in Herzogenaurach, outside of Nuremberg. Kitten was only 16, but a bit of a wild child. She had a very unhappy childhood, being traded between her grandmother, whom she thought was her mother, and her real mother, whom she thought was her sister. She was petite and gorgeous, with jet black hair, often compared to the actress Vivien Leigh from Gone with the Wind.
Vivien Leigh, my favorite actress of all time.
Really?
Yeah, I've always
Cool.
loved her.
Nice.
Jean was 6'3" and 235 pounds, compared to Kitten being 5'2" and barely over 100 pounds. But the two hit it off, and Jean was entranced when he saw her sing in the musical Oklahoma. And the two dated there in Germany for over a year.
Kitten hated her mother with a passion, had grown up thinking the woman was her sister, and felt trapped and caged by her. And she saw Jean as a means of getting out of Germany. She'd even thought of murdering her mother, saying,
I was wanting to kill her. I was so desperate to get away. What kept me from pursuing it was I didn't want to go to jail.
The situation with Kitten and her mother became so bad that at one point, Kitten attempted to overdose on pills and ended up in the hospital getting her stomach pumped.
But Kitten and Jean were wed in the village of Hochstad by the mayor himself. It was not a happy marriage. The couple argued constantly, and Karen would get drunk at bars and flirt with other men. She was only 17, and then Jean would get in fights with these other men, and the two would often smack each other as well.
Karen soon gave birth to a little boy named Rodney in Nuremberg on March 26, 1960. But the teenager felt little joy. Instead, she felt trapped. The couple continued to bicker and fight, and Karen says that when she became pregnant with her next child, Wayne, it was because Jean had raped her, something she would later tell Wayne, that he was the product of rape. And that is one fucked up thing to tell your little kid.
Tell me about it. And interestingly, Karen herself was said to be the product of rape as well. Her mother, whom she'd thought was her sister growing up, had been raped as a young girl and then become pregnant with Karen.
So Wayne was the product of 2 generations of rape and would go on to become a rapist himself. Is it a crazy cosmic coincidence, or is it genetics? Or the way they were raised with a stigma attached to them? I don't know. Honestly, I have no clue.
Marrying Jean did get Kitten out of Germany and away from her mother, as Jean was then sent back to the United States and stationed in Two Rock Ranch outside of Petaluma, where their second child, their final child, would be born, Wayne.
Petaluma back then was very all-American, with white picket fences and clean streets, rose gardens, surrounded by lush, fertile farmland. It's like something out of a Ray Bradbury story. Very wholesome.
Rodney and Wayne grew up sharing a room and sleeping on bunk beds, brothers and best buds, though they were quite different. Rodney had dark hair like his mother and her independent spirit. Wayne was blonde and a shy mama's boy, literally clutching his mother's apron strings. To neighbors and friends, they appeared the perfect happy family, but behind closed doors, things were different.
Jean and Kitten fought often. There was just a feeling of animosity between the two, and they'd both take it out on the kids, beating both Rodney and Wayne with a belt, leaving welts. And if the brothers ever got in an argument with each other, Jean would make them put on boxing gloves and duke it out. And Wayne, being the youngest and much smaller, always got a pounding.
Rodney always took the whippings he received from his father stoically, but Wayne would become terrified and often try to hide.
But often Jean was overseas, having risen through the ranks of the army and now being involved in intelligence work, and frequently sent to Beirut, Tehran, and Bangkok. Eventually, he was told he was to be stationed in Okinawa for a long period, and the whole family then up and moved to Japan.
Kitten, who did not want to go and had pleaded with Jean to let her stay in Petaluma with the kids, was miserable in Japan. Once, Rodney found her in the kitchen in a pool of blood with her wrists cut. She just smiled and said she'd cut herself on a can of beans. She was also drinking and sleeping around, and when Jean discovered she had slept with a soldier under his command, he sent her back to the States to stay with his family in Eureka, California.
Kitten gets to Eureka with Rodney and Wayne in tow and proceeds to have an affair with Jean's 15-year-old brother, Billy. Wow, too much. And Wayne hears about it, leaves Japan, getting himself discharged from the army as staff sergeant, and moves them 220 miles away from Eureka, down the 101 to Santa Rosa.
And Jean and Kitten are still fighting like cats and dogs. Like kittens and dogs. At one point, he pulled a gun on her over an argument about sex, saying,
"If I can't sleep with you, then no one can sleep with you."
She ended up running out of the house screaming, banging on the neighbor's door. The cops were called, and the marriage was officially over, and the two divorced.
And within just 2 days, Kitten's Vietnam War vet boyfriend, who was 7 years younger than her, moved into the house. It was a weird situation, and Wayne, now 12, was acting out, getting in trouble at school, arguing, throwing temper tantrums. It's just a tense situation. So what does Kitten do? She packs his bags and throws him out. He's 12, and she kicks him out to the curb and locks the door behind him. So Wayne calls his father Gene and explains how Kitten has thrown him out into the street, and Wayne moves in with his father.
Then Kitten threw Rodney out as well, who goes to live with family friends for a while, but eventually moves in with his father too. All was more or less good until Gene remarried. Then Wayne really began to get into trouble. He punched his English teacher, who was pregnant at the time, and then broke into a sporting goods store in a daring robbery, going through the skylight and rappelling down, stealing shotgun shells and camping supplies, only to become filled with remorse and rat himself out.
And for his punishment, the cops made him wash their patrol cars. What kind of Opie and Andy bullshit is that? Having to wash police cars as a punishment. And then he moved on to stealing cars, staying out all night, and worrying everyone. He'd really transformed from the shy, sensitive mama's boy into a full-blown juvenile delinquent.
His father had enough and shipped him up to Eureka to live with his uncle Jimmy, whom Wayne really liked, and he tried to please him and be a good person, but he just couldn't help himself. Stole his car and ran away, only to become filled with remorse and turn himself into the police later. I'm sensing a pattern here.
Old blockhead Wayne. When Wayne was only 16, he decided to join the Marines and asked his father to sign the papers to allow him to go, which his father happily did, ecstatic at the idea. And in 1979, at the tender age of 17, Wayne Adam Ford entered boot camp and was trained to be a lean, mean, fighting machine.
Chapter 2. Jarhead Wayne. Wayne did very well in the Marines. At first, at least. He was accepted into NBC, or Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Warfare Preparedness School, and went on to become an instructor, where he received meritorious advancement to corporal and received Instructor of the Month for 13 weeks straight.
On Halloween 1980, he was set up on a blind date by a friend with a petite, pretty blonde woman named Kelly Dick. They went to Shakey's Pizza in Irvine. Do you remember Shakey's Pizza?
I don't think did we have Shakey's Pizza on the East Coast? I don't know.
They had one in Baltimore. I loved it. They used to play black and white horror movies on the walls.
Oh, nice. That's fun.
I think there's still one in Sacramento. I think that's where they originally, the chain started. It might be the last one. I don't know.
I'm curious. Now I'm gonna have to look up if we had them here. But yeah, Wayne would often walk 15 miles from the Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, where he lived on base, to see Kelly. One night in November, she was driving Wayne back to his base when they saw a car accident on the side of the highway, and Wayne instructed Kelly to pull over.
Wayne rushed up to the car to see the driver with a horrible throat injury from the shattered glass, one of their corroded arteries looking cut. Wayne, now a Marine, immediately applied pressure to the wound to stop the bleeding and instructed Kelly to go find a phone and call an ambulance while he performed first aid.
Kelly sped off into the night, and as Wayne sat there on the side of the road, clutching the neck of the injured driver, barreling down the road came a drunk driver, side-swiping the car, slamming into Wayne and throwing him off the roadway and down a 40-foot embankment, where he landed on his face, knocking his teeth out, shattering his jaw, and nearly ripping his lips off.
When Kelly returned to the scene, she was mystified. He was gone. There were cops everywhere, and she asked them,
"Seen my boyfriend? Big jarhead, not easy to miss."
But no one knew who she was talking about, not realizing she meant the man who'd landed in the embankment on his face and been the first to be ambulanced away.
Kelly searched everywhere for him until 3 a.m, not knowing where he was until the next day when she received a call from the hospital saying he wanted to see her. Wayne was in the intensive care unit. He'd received massive head trauma, his eyes black and blue, his head swollen. He had difficulty using the left side of his body.
And after he got out of the hospital, Kelly offered to let him stay with her so she could nurse him back to health. During this time, their relationship blossomed, and they spent time traveling the state, going north to Santa Rosa to visit Kitten and Rodney. Then Wayne received notice from the Marines that he was being sent to Alabama for training. Telling Kelly he'd earn much more money from the military if he was married, he proposed, and she accepted. The two decided to elope in Las Vegas, then hold a big ceremony later in the fall when he got back from Alabama.
With marriage came a change in Wayne towards Kelly. He was no longer sweet or caring. He was domineering and demanding, argumentative. He'd get angry at her and punch holes in the wall, once hitting a stud and breaking every knuckle in his right hand. And in Alabama, he hawked his wedding ring to go drinking with friends.
Ooh, that's low. Real low. Wayne returned from Alabama to discover his new wife was pregnant. While this would have been a joyous time for most newlyweds, Wayne was angry and demanded she have an abortion. She put up a fight at first, saying she wanted to keep their baby, but then relented and did what he said. He would also demand sex constantly, at any time, day or night, telling her he'd only married her for a, quote, steady piece of ass.
Their whole relationship began to be solely about sex. Wayne demanded she wear no clothing in the house, even cooking in the nude. He found a weird deck of playing cards in Hollywood featuring images of women's breasts in various stages of bondage, with ropes and straps wrapped around them, and insisted Kelly let him try to imitate the cards. He even made her dip her breasts in wax to make a mold of them.
This guy is obsessed and taking it to new levels. Listen to this one. He cuts holes in a sheet so she can lay beneath the sheet, and all he can see of her is her breasts. Talk about objectifying a person, seeing them as an object. It's fucking insane.
That's bizarre and awful. One day, Kelly and Wayne were in the arcade at the mall. It's the 80s after all. Slipping quarters into the Pac-Man, the screens glowing in the darkness, the place digitally alive and buzzing with crazy beeps and pew-pew going over Madonna's Lucky Star. And a nerdy kid with thick glasses bumped into Wayne's elbow, causing him to lose his game.
Wayne turned around and punched the kid square in the face. Remember, Wayne's a Marine. With just one punch, he broke the kid's nose, cut open his eyebrow so badly it needed several stitches, and embedded his glasses into his face.
Wayne then takes a trip with some friends who were fellow Marines, and they head to Big Bear Lake in the San Bernardino Mountains, about 95 miles east of Los Angeles.
A beautiful place. Love it. It's crazy. You can go snowboarding there, jump in your car, drive 2 hours, and go surfing.
It's rad.
Totally. Well, there, high in the mountains with rugged trails and the beautiful outdoors, monstrous Doug firs that make those really huge pine cones, and big leaf maples, just exquisite hiking. What does this group of Marines decide to do? Go to a roller skating rink. It was the 80s, I guess. And they met some girls there. I'm imagining in the arcade, like they challenged them to air hockey or something. And all the Marines slipped off their wedding rings and pocketed them and started chatting the girls up, asking them if they wanted to go party.
They brought the girls, who it ends up are only 15 years old, their children, back to their cabin, and apparently Wayne raped one of them. She called the police, and when the cops showed up, he took off out the back door and into the woods, traversing through 15 miles of forest, where he found a payphone and called Kelly, telling her what he'd done, not ashamed and laughing about it, before eventually being picked up by the cops and arrested.
Their marriage was falling apart, and Wayne, in a desperate attempt to keep her from leaving him, said he'd go and see a marriage counselor with her, which they did. First, the counselor met with each of them alone. Then they all talked together, the veins in Wayne's neck beginning to throb and his eye twitching as Kelly discussed her issues with the marriage.
The counselor suggested they try a week's separation to think things over. He living on the Marine base while she stayed in the house, as they got their heads together and then could come back to counseling. They both agreed to this. Afterwards, the counselor pulled Kelly aside and told her not to go home with him, to find a ride and go somewhere else, for she felt he was dangerous.
Immediately, Wayne began to stalk Kelly, following her everywhere and staking out the house. She went out to dinner with some coworkers. When she returned, she saw his car, which frightened her, so she went to her sister's house to spend the night. Wayne had returned to their house that night with a dozen roses, then drank a bottle of whiskey while waiting, and as the night wore on, changed into a camouflage outfit and hid in the bushes all night with a bow and arrow, determined to kill her and whoever she was with.
At this point, Kelly is done and wants a divorce. Yeah. One of Kelly's coworkers was a guy named Bob, whom she confided to about what was going on. Bob was in the midst of a marriage breakup himself and offered her advice. Soon, the two became a couple.
Now, this is some of the weirdest, most awkwardly absurd and disturbing stuff that you've ever heard right here. Wayne is seemingly all cool with the divorce, which came as both a surprise and a relief to Kelly. He didn't blow up, freak out, punch holes in the walls, but he did ask if he could go to breakfast with her and Bob to meet him. She called Bob, and Bob agreed, saying he'll meet them at the restaurant. Then, horrifyingly, Wayne grabs Kelly and rapes her, then tells her to get dressed, and they go to the restaurant together to meet Bob.
Kelly is traumatized, sitting there in a booth with her coworker whom she'd fallen in love with, and her psychopath, unhinged husband.
It's very surreal, kind of like a David Lynch moment, like in the bar in Blue Velvet. You can almost like hear 50s jazz music and everything is absolutely surreal. And Wayne starts asking Bob if he knows any girls Bob could introduce him to. Bob's absolutely cool. He can see what's happening. He tells Wayne, well, geez, sorry, no, I don't know any girls I can introduce you to.
Bob is also a big guy, and he knew how to fight. He thought he might be able to take the Marine, or at least give him hell trying. He gives his car keys and his apartment keys to Kelly, tells her, drive back to your house, pack your stuff in my car, then drive to my apartment. I'll meet you there later. He then asks Wayne if he wants to take a walk with him. The two head out of the restaurant, down the street, and Bob turns to Wayne and says, okay, is this it? You want to fight me?
And Wayne says, no, man, I'm totally happy for you. I hope you two have a wonderful life together. And they walk back to the house where Kelly is packing, and Wayne waves goodbye to them as they drive away together.
Chapter 3. The Nervous Breakdown. On April 8th, 1983, Wayne was admitted to the Naval Hospital's psychiatric ward in Long Beach after complaining about debilitating depression. Filling out the forms under emotional difficulties, he checked every box available: nervousness, tension, depression, low self-esteem. Then wrote he hadn't been happy since he was 7 and his parents divorced.
After a couple days, the doctor wrote, patient stabilized, quickly on ward without meds, and sent him on his way. A month later, he saw a psychiatrist at the El Toro base and was diagnosed with, quote, adjustment reaction and a personality disorder with explosive and immature features, end quote, which sounds intense to me, but he was still put on full duty and sent to Okinawa, Japan.
After a dispute with a supervising officer during inspection, he was demoted from sergeant to corporal. Then he was found in his barracks in a catatonic state. He was taken from the barracks, but refused to speak and was brought to a psych ward, where he became violent and ran from the building and had to be forcibly returned.
He then began to babble about how he wanted to go to law school and be a lawyer. Remember, he dropped out of high school in the 10th grade to join the Marines. He stopped eating, became violent. They had to sedate him, then restrain him, pumping him full of Halidol, which has the awful side effect of causing terrible muscle cramps. He was locked up in seclusion where he paced back and forth, alternately praying and singing pop country songs.
He was diagnosed with severe and chronic borderline personality disorder and flown to the Letterman Army Hospital in San Francisco. They diagnosed him with, and we quote from the medical records, 1. Borderline personality disorder, severe as manifested by intense and inappropriate anger and lack of control of anger, marked shift in mood from normal to depression, irritability and anxiety, depression, chronic feelings of emptiness. 2. Atypical psychosis manifested by frequent psychotic breaks. Rule out schizophrenia.
In the report, it also states he admitted to homicidal ideations, saying he fantasized killing his wife and her new lover. After being transferred to several more hospitals, the wheels of the bureaucracy finally churned, and he was discharged from the Marines for the, quote, convenience of the government, character and behavior disorders, end quote.
Chapter 4. Wadad, the love of Wayne's life. After getting kicked out of the military, Wayne moved to Eureka and lived with his uncle, repairing boats at a fishery. The pay was good, but it was back-breaking work, and Wayne soon left rainy Humboldt and headed down the 101 in a long, long drive to sunny Southern California.
He changed his name to Adam, his middle name, and worked a long string of jobs. He sold cars at not one, but two dealerships, delivered papers, drove a school bus for disabled children, worked as a security guard and a tow truck driver. He also met a pretty Kuwaiti girl named Wadad.
He'd later say she was the love of his life, and his happiest times had been with her. They'd be together off and on for 6 years.
But just like with Kelly, soon the sex was getting weird and rough. He became obsessed with putting a safety pin into her nipple.
This is a clear display of piqueurism, a paraphilia where sexual gratification is achieved through penetrating the skin of another person with a sharp object, an often very dangerous fetish that you see in many, many serial killers, particularly those that use a knife.
Wadad never let him push the safety pin too far in, though, always screaming that it hurt and telling him to stop. He also demanded she bite his nipples, to the point she was scared she'd actually rip them off with her teeth. But unlike Kelly, he never demanded sex from her or raped her.
They moved into a house together, and one day Wayne came home in tears, saying he'd done something terrible but wouldn't tell her what. Finally, she demanded he tell her, and he said he had been walking down the street, seen a pretty woman, and lost control. He ran up to her, ripped her purse from her hands, and threw it on the roof of a building, then bit her breast and ran off.
Fucking red flag there. I mean, that's more than a red flag. It's a deal breaker. It's not a deal breaker. It's a grab your shit and run away and don't look back. Just what the fuck? Either get him help or leave at that point. Like,
Run so fast.
yeah.
Wayne was also caught peeping into windows, as all of these creeps do, but in old Wayne fashion, he wasn't really caught so much as ratted himself out and admitted it. Like always, he does these things, then feels terrible and has to confess to them.
Wayne then shot the neighbor's dogs and got arrested for firing a weapon in the city limits and cruelty to animals. But that didn't stop Wadad from accepting when he proposed to her. But after years and years of this nonsense, often breaking up for extended periods and getting back together, one day she finally realized he had no respect for her or anyone, especially women, whom he saw as literal objects. And she finally left him for good.
But Wayne moved on quickly. It was 1994, and the hot thing was karaoke. And he became a DJ at a Japanese karaoke restaurant. And it was there that he hooked up with 21-year-old Elizabeth Alt. And it wasn't long before they were off to Vegas to get married. This is Wayne's second Vegas marriage.
And now that they were married and he had the young girl right where he wanted her, Wayne started getting weird as hell with the sex. His thing now was he wanted to watch her fuck other guys. He got her drunk as hell one night and convinced her to take home a Marine they met at a bus stop. This sounds like some Penthouse Forum smut right here. They literally picked up a Marine at a bus stop. And Wayne watched masturbating as Elizabeth had sex with the stranger.
She later said she hated it and thought it was disgusting. But she felt trapped and just thought, if he'll leave me alone about it, I'll do it just this once.
Very quickly, Elizabeth was pregnant. But Wayne just became crueler and more violent with her, demanding she cook breakfast for him when she was vomiting from morning sickness. Then one day, he wrapped a leather belt around her neck, raped her, told her he would kill her if she didn't comply with his sexual demands. Then, as he beat her with the belt, she was able to free herself and ran from him, screaming out the door, naked.
The married and naive young woman, now pregnant, went back to this monster. They moved to Las Vegas, and she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy they named Max. But fatherhood didn't change Wayne. Now he wanted Elizabeth to start working as a prostitute.
And he started up with the safety pin and the nipple bit again. And he'd sit around on the couch all day, masturbating.
It got so bad that Elizabeth moved in with her mother, who also lived in Las Vegas. Wayne just packed up and moved back to California. His son was only 6 months old.
Wayne moved back to Humboldt County, living in Eureka at his uncle's house, and working at Arcata Ready Mix cement and gravel mining plant, which is now called Eureka Ready Mix, even though it is in Arcata. He also karaoke DJ'd throughout Northern California. He acted weird as hell, lounging about in a silk robe before all his cousins, and sometimes dressing up in a suit and tie and aimlessly wandering around Eureka with a briefcase. Times when I think he was most likely stalking women, as the deaths would soon begin.
Chapter 5. Torso in the Slough. October 26th, 1997, was a beautiful sunny day. But autumn was in the air, with a chilly breeze, as nature photographer Bob Popberg set his kayak down in Freshwater Creek, the oak leaves yellowing and falling about him, as he headed down out of the forest of redwoods and firs toward the Humboldt Bay, as the creek fed into Ryan's Slough.
Eureka, California is made up of all these sloughs. Such a cool word. They're these little marshy waterways to the bay, tributaries. Sometimes the bay will spill out into them during high tide, but rainwater and creeks are flowing fresh water in. They're famous because Ulysses S. Grant was stationed out in Eureka in the early part of the Civil War and would get completely wasted and fall into these sloughs.
Bob was planning on taking the slough all the way into the bay, and then going to the boat ramp under the Samoa Bridge where he'd get picked up.
Don't forget to go to Woodley Island to get yourself some fresh live crabs right off the boat, and some oysters too.
Sounds delicious. But before Bob could make it to the Humboldt Bay, he made a gruesome discovery. In the heath and shore grass where the brackish water leaked around by a black willow was a pale form caught in the bramble. Something Bob thought at first was a mannequin.
It's never a mannequin, as they famously say on the True Crime Garage podcast. And yes, True Crime Garage podcast said it first. Don't let anyone tell you differently. But it is never a mannequin.
Yes, it wasn't a mannequin. It was a woman's torso. She'd been decapitated, her arms and legs chopped off, her breasts removed with near surgical precision, and her vagina removed as well.
Though Wayne Adam Ford would confess to this murder, saying she was a hippie girl he picked up on the streets of Eureka and took to Clam Beach and strangled before hauling her corpse to his trailer in Arcata and butchering her in the bathtub. It would take 25 years before her identity would be revealed as Carrie Ann Cummings through DNA in 2022.
Carrie was a free spirit hippie. She'd hitchhiked down to Arcata from Eugene, Oregon, another big hippie hotspot. Wayne said she was wearing patchwork pants. He called them clown pants, and a colorful newsboy cap.
She wanted to camp on the beach, meet other hippie freaks. There's often little shelters built out there in out-of-way places along the cliffs where crusties, hippies, punks, and drunks and transient weirdos of all ilk hang out, playing drums and puffing on weed.
But unfortunately, this free spirit ran into a monster named Wayne Ford.
This would be his first victim, or so he claims at least, but far from his last. Word of the sexually mutilated torso quickly spread through the community. On Halloween night, at the Ford family dinner in Eureka, at his grandmother's house, Wayne's aunt asked,
"That's just terrible. Who would do such a thing?"
Wayne just silently stared down at his plate. You know, my friend says that he was on a school bus when the police were pulling that torso from the slough. Myrtle Avenue goes right over it. And he says the school bus drove right past it. And everyone was stopping and gawking, and traffic had slowed to a crawl. And all the children on the bus saw it being pulled out. He said it really traumatized him seeing it.
Just 3 weeks later, on November 25th, Karen Mitchell, just 17 years old, left the Bayshore Mall to walk to the Coastal Family Development Center and was never seen again. Terror began to spread through the area.
On January 29th, 1998, a couple collecting driftwood on the beach in McKinleyville pulled a sunburned and slightly mummified human arm from the surf.
Chapter 6. Blockhead Wayne. Wayne took a vacation and drove out to Las Vegas and visited Elizabeth and his toddler son, bringing him a bicycle and a helmet, even though the kid could barely walk. It was awkward, and Elizabeth felt he had been stalking her during his visit.
On June 2nd, 1998, workers for a construction company way down in Bakersfield, an inland city about 110 miles north of Los Angeles, known for its agriculture production, discovered the nude and badly bloated body of a woman in an aqueduct, her body caught on a steel cable connecting several buoys.
She'd been strangled to death, her neck fractured and circled with a ligature mark. Fingerprints revealed her name to be Tyne Renee Gibbs, a sex worker from Las Vegas.
After visiting Las Vegas, Wayne headed back to Eureka, passing through Bakersfield on the way, continuing to work at Arcata Ready Mix and getting himself an old school shiny aluminum Airstream trailer on a spot in a trailer park right next to the cement plant, only a fence separating the two. But Wayne strained his back working, and after going on workman's compensation leave, strolled right across the street to Edeline Trucking and asked them to hire him.
The boss at Edeline Trucking knew him and hired him right there. Assigned him truck number 60, one of the nicest in the fleet, which had a sleeper cab and a 45-foot flatbed. And that very night, Wayne was hauling freight down the state.
June 16th, 1998, Wayne was driving his truck through Anaheim, where Disneyland is, when he picked up a prostitute in a gas station parking lot. He offered her $40 just to sit in his truck and watch him as he masturbated, which she accepted. They climbed into the sleeper where no one could see them, and there Wayne stripped her naked and tied her arms behind her back with a nylon rope that he then looped around her neck so that if she struggled, she'd choke herself. With another rope, he bound her wrists and ankles together After gagging her to muffle her screams, he, this is rough, folks, warning, he burned her breasts and vagina with a cigarette lighter, then raped her while choking her into unconsciousness to the point of actual death, and then bringing her back with CPR, which he'd been trained to do in the Marines, only to choke her unconscious again, over and over.
That is fucking horrifying. He then stole all her money and kicked her out into the street, telling her she was lucky to be alive because others were not.
Rachel Holt was a 22-year-old sex worker living at the Motel 6 in Santa Rosa and working the streets there when a big, shiny semi-truck pulled up and the driver asked her if she wanted a date. She was very small, only 4'11", and actually had difficulty climbing up into the big cab. They pulled off to a secluded spot and went into the sleeper compartment and attempted to have sex. But the driver, who was obsessed with aggressively fondling her breasts, couldn't achieve an erection.
He asked her to get on her knees and put her hands behind her back, as that position always got him aroused. And when the young girl did as he asked, he grabbed her wrists and tied them together. She screamed, and he told her if she made another sound, he'd kill her, and then told her to bite his nipples, which, because of the way she was hogtied, she was unable to do. She couldn't crane her head up enough.
He used men's ties to gag and blindfold her, and again, burned her vagina, repeatedly raped her, choking her, and used CPR to bring her in and out of consciousness. The harrowing and awful ordeal lasted for hours.
He then completely changed. He calmed down, untied her, allowed her to put her clothes on. She asked him why he'd done what he'd done, and he showed her a picture of Elizabeth and said he wanted revenge for her having taken off with his son. Then he broke down into tears and apologized to her, saying because she had given him a shoulder to cry on, he'd let her go.
He stole all her money, but as he dropped her off on the side of the road, he handed her a $100 bill so that she could get back home.
She managed to make it to a payphone and call 911 and was taken to the Sutter Hospital. The nurse who examined her said that out of all of the 175 rape victims she had examined, Rachel was the most severely injured.
Chapter 7. The Road Trip from Hell. This is just a crazy story here. Very weird. It really displays the bizarre personality of Wayne Ford. Just unstable and very, very scary. He is truly terrifying.
Back in Eureka, Valerie Rondy was hitchhiking along Broadway, which is the strip of Highway 101 as it enters the south end of the city. She was a friendly, personable woman who'd fallen into heroin addiction and would sometimes engage in work as a prostitute if she had to make ends meet.
Rondy strolled past the cheap hotels, trash billowing down the sidewalk as cars rushed by. A Dodge Neon pulled up, driven by a man calling himself Adam. He was, of course, Wayne Adam Ford. He was driving his grandmother's car.
Wayne and Valerie negotiated on a price for sex, agreeing on $60, and he took her back to his grandmother's house where he was house sitting. The two engaged in more or less normal sex. The only weird thing was Wayne not being satisfied with how hard she could pinch his nipples.
Afterwards, Wayne asked her to stay and talk to him, saying he was lonely, and Valerie, who wasn't a full-time sex worker, just someone trying to make ends meet, agreed. Wayne told her about his ex-wife and his son Max. He then showed off his 18-wheeler to her, saying he was given the best truck in the fleet. And she said,
"Must be fun driving around everywhere."
He said it was, but it was a lonely job, and asked her if she'd like to accompany him on a delivery to Santa Rosa the next day. Santa Rosa is only a few hours away, and he assured her he'd have her back by the evening at the latest. So she thought, what the hell? and agreed.
The trip started off well enough. Valerie was very friendly, and they chatted as they headed down the highway, through the Redwoods and into the vineyards of Sonoma County, Wayne telling her his ex-wife was the actress from the soap opera General Hospital, who'd fell in love with him after hearing him sing in bars.
They stopped at the lumber yard in Santa Rosa, where Wayne was supposed to drop off his load of wood. But Wayne then informed her there'd been a mix-up, and he'd been given the wrong location. And he had to take the shipment to Escondido, way down in San Diego County. For listeners who don't realize just how huge California is, it is 750 miles from Eureka to Escondido. Easily a 13-hour drive each way.
Oh, good God. Valerie was livid. She'd told him she was a heroin user and that she only had enough dope to get her through the day. Now he wanted to drive all the way to Escondido? But Wayne assured her he'd find her some heroin on the way. He knew lots of people at the various truck stops along the route. She demanded he take her to a bus station, but he begged her to stay with him, and she finally relented when he promised her he'd buy her all the heroin she wanted on the long, long road trip.
They drove nearly all night, stopping at a huge truck stop in the morning. Wayne tried to talk her into sex, offering to pay her, but she was going into the first stages of heroin withdrawal and refused. So he went into his sleeping bunk and loudly masturbated before falling asleep.
The next morning, Wayne drank 18 beers as they drove Interstate 5 up over the Tejon Pass in the Grapevine, one of the most dangerous sections of highway in the United States.
They finally got down into the San Fernando Valley. As they drove through the chaos of Los Angeles, Valerie asked him,
"When can we score some dope, man? I'm really sick. You promised me."
He just ignored her. But when they got into Orange County, he suddenly told her he'd just drop her off in San Clemente, a place she'd never been to before, to find some heroin. Terrified of being junk sick in a strange city where she knew no one, she declined.
After dropping off the lumber in Escondido, Wayne said they now had to go to Chula Vista, all the way down on the border with Mexico.
Valerie was freaking out at this point, and Wayne was becoming more and more aggressive. After going to Chula Vista, they stopped for the night, and Wayne again asked for sex. This time, she relented, too weak to resist him, just laying there in withdrawal pain. And in the morning, she was in full-on junk sickness, vomiting, feverish, racked with chills and cold sweat. And Wayne announced they were going to Nevada now.
But at a truck stop along the way, Valerie was able to find another trucker headed to Humboldt and got a ride to Fortuna, then paid someone to drive her the rest of the way back home to Eureka.
And a couple days later, Valerie's phone rang. Who should it be? But old blockhead Wayne, wondering if she wanted to hang out again. Wisely, she hung up on him.
Wise indeed. Though it was a road trip from hell, Valerie was very lucky to make it home alive. Unfortunately, as knucklehead Wayne Ford traversed the state of California, in and out of Nevada, hauling goods back and forth from Eureka, other women who crossed his path would not be so lucky.
On September 25th, 1998, a group of ranchers towing a cattle trailer pulled over along Highway 12 near Lodi to change a plug wire when they discovered the pale, lifeless body of a woman floating in an irrigation canal. Investigators would find a plastic bag with the logo for Flying J truck stops on it nearby, spattered in blood. Fingerprints revealed the woman to be 25-year-old Lynette White, a mother who had fallen into crystal meth use and resorted to prostitution to feed her habit, often working out of truck stops.
On October 23, 1998, two guards discovered the naked body of a woman caught up in a gate in the California Aqueduct in Hesperia, the same place Tina Gibbs' body had been found. She had ligature marks on her wrists and ankles. Her back had been broken while she was still alive, which would have paralyzed her from the waist down, and her left breast had been removed post-mortem.
Fingerprints would identify her as 29-year-old Anna Tamez. Like Lynette, she was a mother who had fallen into crystal meth use, only she had not only been a user, but was heavily involved in the manufacturing of the substance as well. And after a long series of arrests, had spiraled out of control into psychosis and come to rely on sex work to pay for her habit. She was last seen on the side of the highway, disappearing into the door of a black 18-wheeler truck.
Back in Humboldt County, Wayne was slowly losing it. Many serial killers are able to carry on by compartmentalizing their issues. They are able to lock their dark deeds and horrific fantasies away in their mind, like files in a cabinet, to access or ignore at will. Wayne did not have this ability. He had no control over his feelings, which brought on a strange sort of remorse and a desire to be punished. He did try to compartmentalize his issues, though, on an actually physical level. He had his Airstream in the trailer park in Arcata, but in an effort to escape the horrors he'd committed there, using his bathtub to butcher bodies and the oven to cook the parts, he spent most of his time at Cabin Zero in Trinidad. And he also had a campsite just north of Trinidad in Patrick's Point as well.
Wayne's campsite was tucked up in the Redwoods across from Patrick's Point Park, now called Sumeg Park, to honor the natives who had a village there, parts of which still remain.
Wayne's little campsite was well stocked and provisioned. He had been a Marine, after all. He had a 2-person dome tent with an array of tarps to keep out the torrential rains Humboldt is known for, and coils of ropes and a shovel. Inside, he had an air mattress and sleeping bag, mosquito netting, an ice chest, cans of beef stew, chili and tuna, coffee, a stash of lighters, several hunting knives, a hatchet, binoculars, diving fins, pepper spray, his guitar, a crucifix, a Bible, some women's panties, and a huge array of pornographic magazines. That's sort of like the redneck guide to like survival. Like if a prepper wants a list, you can look to that to get you started.
Yeah. Oh, at this campsite, he attempted to literally bury the past, burying the thighs of Carrie Ann Cummings he kept for over a year in his freezer, as well as other body parts. But the breast of Anna Tamez was too great a trophy and fetish object to rid himself of, and he kept it close, very close, in his jacket pocket.
In a way, he reverted to a child again, the little boy that was scared of the world and hung on to his mother's apron strings. For he began to call his mother, often late at night, crying, saying she wasn't going to love him anymore, that he was sorry, asking her why she'd never loved him, why she never told him she loved him as a child, weeping and blubbering into the phone that he was going to hide in the woods where no one could find him.
Wayne cruised the streets of Eureka, drinking Budweiser and trolling down Broadway, a place where he'd found women to abduct before, and then decided to hit up the Bayshore Mall, going into Ross to buy a wallet.
The clerk later said he looked disheveled and dirty and reeked of alcohol as he smiled at her and said,
"Remember this face? This is the face of a serial killer."
"That's not funny," the clerk said. "And it's not true either."
Wayne laughed and said, "Well, you never know. Stranger things have happened."
Then he drove up the coast to McKinleyville, where he went to a Christian bookstore and prayed with the owner, telling him he'd done some pretty bad things, but didn't feel really bad about them, so he didn't think he had a conscience. The owner assured Wayne that he did have a conscience, then sold him a cassette tape of the Bible.
Wayne listened to the Bible on his tape deck as he drove up the coast, past the pale sand and dunes of Clam Beach, where he'd strangled Carrie Ann Cummings before bringing her home to butcher in his bathtub. He watched as the Pacific Ocean came crashing its waves against tall rocks jutting from the sea before stretching out vast and blue to meet the horizon. The highway, now lonely and empty, the sun eclipsed by the looming redwoods, reaching impossibly high above him. He took the Patrick Point exit, found a secluded spot to park his car, then tromped out into the redwoods to his campsite through the shadows and the massive ferns, prehistoric in the splintered light. He lay in his tent, drank beers, took the bag with the severed breast from his pocket, staring at the fat, the strange yellow curds that make up the inside of this thing he both loved and hated, fondling it as he masturbated, thought of the butchered thighs he'd recently buried there, off the trail, under a rotting redwood stump. He then fell into a fitful sleep.
When he woke, he walked through the forest, down the trail into Patrick's Point Drive, a cracked and rutted strip of asphalt threading down above the ocean past trailer parks and tourist cabins, along 5 miles to the Ocean Grove Lodge, the neon sign on the roof like a beacon for the lost. Cocktails.
At the Ocean Grove Lodge, he got his usual cabin, the cheapest one, room 0, that used to be a barber shop long ago. Then went to the bar, sat down amongst the fishermen and loggers, and asked for a Budweiser. He drank it, chatting with the locals, and had another, then moved on to rum and cokes, had a few of those, looked at the bartender, and told him he wanted to blow his brains out.
All the old-timers, of course, had a lot of sympathy for the big truck driver. His ex-wife and kid way out in Vegas, poor guy. They told him things would be all right. Wayne polished off 2 giant Polish hot dogs and then had 2 coffees with Bailey's cream. Then he went out to the payphone and called his brother. One of the patrons sang to him as he walked out the doors and into the gathering dusk.
Can't be that bad, buddy. Things will look better tomorrow.
Of course, tomorrow would find Wayne bringing a severed human breast into the Eureka Sheriff's Station.
One of the local crowd that was there at the bar that night later told the Times Standard newspaper, quote, "Usually he'd have on a cowboy hat and boots. I really thought he was one of us."
Chapter 7. It's all over now, baby blue. After going through a brief period where he wanted a lawyer, Wayne, comforted by his brother, who told him to just tell everything to the police and get it off his chest and into the open, to help the grieving families, confessed to multiple murders throughout California, explaining how he'd kept the precious severed breast in his truck refrigerator for weeks. He told them how he'd dumped the torso of Carrie Ann Cummings into the Ryan Slough off of Myrtle Avenue before it turns into Old Arcata Road.
Wayne then led investigators to both his campground, where the buried thighs were still perfectly preserved since they'd been in his freezer for over a year and then stored in the cool soil and duff beneath a massive redwood stump, and to what he called the boneyard, a gravelly sandbar along the Mad River, directly behind Arcata Ready Mix, where he'd buried Carrie Ann Cummings' head and arms, then covering them with a chunk of concrete.
Sadly, they were long gone, the rains uncovering the remains and washing them into the river, where they were swept out to the Pacific Ocean. One forlorn arm washing up in the surf onto a beach, but the rest, including her head, never to be found.
Afterwards, the detectives bought him a Whopper from Burger King.
When police asked Wayne about Karen Mitchell, a young girl who'd gone missing leaving the Bayshore Mall where Wayne often spent time, he said he'd heard about the case, but it wasn't him. He said he must not be alone, that there must be another one of him out there, another killer.
And there may very well have been, as infamous murderer and suspected serial killer Robert Durst was living in the area at the exact same time. And many people think he was responsible for Karen Mitchell's disappearance. And guess where Robert Durst was living? Trinidad. What do you think the population of Trinidad, California was? 380. Just 380 people in this tiny seaside hamlet. And two of them are serial killers. Fucking crazy, man. And as for Karen Mitchell, to this day, no one knows what happened to her.
Wayne then told detectives about the jar of rendered fat from baking Carrie Ann Cummings' breasts he kept under his sink in his trailer in Arcata, but denied eating any of it or eating any other body parts, though he did keep cuts of her thighs in the freezer for well over a year.
And though he talked about the jar of fat under his sink, he wouldn't talk about the actual butchering of her body in the bathtub. Just saying that bad things happened in the bathtub of his trailer in Arcata. Things he couldn't remember now, then blubbering incoherently.
Investigators asked him if he was a necrophile, to which he said,
What's that?
and one of the cops said,
He has his fun after the girls are dead.
to which Wayne simply said,
I can identify with that.
but he wouldn't state anything further on the matter.
And investigators think there was a lot more he couldn't or wouldn't tell them, things he was too ashamed to admit. And they suspect he may be responsible for many more murders throughout California and even Nevada.
He was brought to trial and found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder.
But guess what? As the sentencing phase of the trial was beginning to see whether he'd get the death penalty or not, love was in the air. Yes, Wayne got himself a girlfriend. And boy, oh boy, was she something. Victoria Redstall, who, and you're not going to believe this, it's too much. Victoria was the spokesmodel for breast enhancement supplements. Yes, I'm not kidding. The guy who had a breast in his pocket now has an admirer who had been a spokesmodel for breast enhancement supplements. And guess what they were called, folks? Can you guess? Herbal Grow Bust. The Herbal Grow Bust spokesmodel had a thing for Wayne Ford. It's insane. Because now she was all about being a true crime writer.
Oh my God.
She said she had a lifelong fascination with serial killers. Hey, so have I, but I don't date them. I'm also obsessed with the Manson family, but I'm not joining a hippie sex and death cult anytime soon either.
Victoria says meeting Ford to interview him for her book was, quote, the dream of a lifetime, end quote. She says she got goosebumps the first time she met him and shared a deeply emotional bond with him. She'd visit constantly, as often as possible, and they'd share details of their childhoods.
My mama never done love me.
They'd also sing country songs together.
When Wayne couldn't remember the lyrics to Dwight Yoakam's 1,000 Miles from Nowhere, she was there for him and found him the lyrics to that dear, dear song. Of course, friends of hers were upset that she was more or less dating a serial killer, to which she said,
everyone tells me, be careful. He's a serial killer. But they don't know Wayne like I do. We've all got evil in us. All of us. He took it to the extent of killing humans, but I'm going on the man he is today and the remorse that he has today.
And I honestly don't know what to say about that statement.
Yeah, man. I mean, like, we've all got evil in us. I mean, like,
yeah, but we all don't have breasts in our pockets.
Right. And yeah, having a shadow side is a far cry from dumping bodies all over the place and the breast in the pocket, right? It's craziness. This is insane. When the bus would drive Wayne from the jail to the courthouse, she'd drive her red convertible beside it so he could gaze out the window and see her there with her long blonde hair flowing in the wind.
I don't think he was looking at her hair.
Good point. It got so bad that it was causing a disruption at the San Bernardino jail, and his lawyers, who, remember, are in the midst of a death penalty case and are literally fighting for his life, they don't like it either, Doesn't look good, and a judge demanded she show credentials proving she was with the press and entitled to see him.
Then a personal investigation by the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department was launched into the visitations. And she really must have pissed them off somehow, because they distributed a flyer, handed it to all the jail staff, stating to not let her enter the building under any circumstances. And when Victoria heard about the flyers, she said,
"Can I get a copy?"
When asked if she was aware of the irony of a breast enhancement spokesman being obsessed with a breast-obsessed serial killer, she said,
"Yes, it's hysterical."
Soon courtroom officials ceased nearly all media access to Ford and even ordered everyone near the courtroom to be out of line of sight when Wayne was escorted down the hall.
And as always, in the end, no one loved poor Wayne Adam Ford because Victoria soon grew bored with him. Worse yet, he got the death penalty and was shuffled back up to Northern California to sit on death row in San Quentin, where he sits today.
And Victoria was off in her red convertible to her new infatuation, I-95 killer, Gary Ray Bowles. She'd eventually write her book about her experiences interviewing death row serial killers, which I have not read. So I have no idea if it's any good, but I do have a slight issue with the title. Amazing true crime author and criminologist Christopher Barry D., who I've actually quoted on this show before. He was the one who said the incredible flood of serial killers in the 70s was most likely because of the post-traumatic stress disorder on their parents' generation from World War II. Well, Christopher Barry D. wrote a legendary book about his time interviewing serial killers and called it Serial Killers Up Close and Personal. It's very well known, required reading for true crime freaks. And Victoria goes and names her book Serial Killers Up Close and Very Personal. Like, really? You just add very to the title of a famous book? And you're obviously trying to steal his sales from confused people. It's not illegal, but it's immoral, in bad taste, unethical. Anyway, I'm not reading that book, but you still see her pop up on true crime TV shows, blabbing away. And she's also an actress and has appeared in a bunch of movies.
Yeah, that's like the second Stephen King that spells his name different, and
he just has a different middle name. It's like Stephen E. King.
Yeah, so trashy. Well, that is the story of Wayne Adam Ford, a killer in the Redwoods. We hope you enjoyed it in all its grisly detail.
And if you want to see some of the locations where this story took place, and they are truly beautiful, the redwood forest, pristine beaches, the jagged cliffs, check out our Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok pages, because I'm going to go visit them and post pictures and maybe even make a little video.
Sounds awesome. I can't wait to see it. And hopefully any of our listeners that have been there as well by any chance will comment as well in the comments on our posts, and excited to hear if anybody has any creepy stories from the area.
There's a few. Murder Mountain on Netflix?
I haven't.
No, I used to live right next to that place.
Interesting.
And we want to hear from you. Did we get something wrong? You got a case you think we should cover? You just want to say hi? Drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. And thank you so much for listening. We will see you next week.